So here is your blood vessels lecture. So just for starters, if you remember, there's two major types of blood vessels. There's arteries and there's veins. So as we talked about previously, arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood towards the heart. And what we're going to now see within tissues, like whether we're talking about systemic tissues like skeletal muscle or even within the lungs, between the arteries and veins, we have what are called capillaries. Capillaries are just these tiny little blood vessels where you actually are able to get exchange of gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, and also nutrients and hormones. So structurally, if we compare the two, you can see there's a pretty big difference between arteries and veins. So on the left, you see an artery. On the right, you see a vein. And these structurally, there's some big differences, which we'll talk about on the upcoming slides. But for starters, we're just going to identify that each of these types of blood vessels, whether it's an artery or a vein, has three distinct layers. So if you start on the inside layer here, this is called the tunica intima. And the big part of that that's important is the inner lining is called the endothelium. That term may ring a bell because this is an example of what we call simple squamous epithelium. So early in the semester we talked about simple squamous epithelium. It's one layer of very thin cells. And when we get that on the inner lining of the blood vessel, it's called the endothelium. The subendothelial layer is just beneath that, but it's less important. The area where you have all the smooth muscle is called the tunica media. So in arteries, that's going to be really, really thick because they have lots of smooth muscle. And then the outermost layer is called the tunica externa. So it consists of other types of connective tissue. It also has some tiny little blood vessels in there itself, and you can see it more so on the vein over here. Those blood vessels that are in that tunica externa, they're actually supplying the smooth muscle of the blood vessels, and that's called the vasa vasorum. So vasa vasorum are the blood vessels in the tunica externa that are supplying the layers of the artery or vein, such as the tunica media that has the smooth muscle that's going to need oxygen itself. So if we compare the two like we did a moment ago, the first thing we notice is that the arteries have really, really thick walls, and the bulk of that is the tunica media, which is where all the smooth muscle is, compared to the vein, which has smooth muscle but just not near as much. Arteries tend to have lots of collagen and elastic fibers also. The lumen, which is the area where the blood is, kind of in the middle where the blood would be, is much smaller in an artery as opposed to a vein. And then one of the rationales for having a really, really thick wall of the arteries is that they're under a lot of pressure, because if you remember, arteries carry blood away from the heart, so they're always going to be carrying blood under really high pressure because it's just leaving the heart. And as you can see in the inside, the arteries have no valves. The veins do. We'll talk about that in a moment. So now looking at the vein, you can see that the thickest layer in the vein is actually the tunica externa, where you have all the vasa vasorum. The lumen, where the blood is really wide, so the veins tend to store a lot of blood because they're so big. They work under low pressure because they're carrying blood back to the heart. Since they're under such low pressure, they have to have these valves. These are one-way valves that prevent blood from backing up. And if you actually take out the blood, like if you in dissection, if you took out a vein versus an artery, the vein would actually collapse because it's very thin-walled, and it's without blood, it's going to just kind of fold over. Whereas in an artery, the wall is so thick that it'll actually stay kind of open. So here's a quick review of some of the differences between arteries and veins. We've actually talked about all of these, so it's there for your reference, and I'm going to move on. So again, some details about arteries. Again, some of this is review. Carry blood away from the heart. Systemic arteries have oxygenated blood. Pulmonary arteries, on the other hand, have deoxygenated blood. Types: elastic, muscular, and arterioles. You'll see that on the upcoming picture I'm going to show you. But general rule of thumb, as the arteries that are close to the heart are very elastic. As they get further away, they become more muscular. And then just before you get into capillaries, you get these really tiny arteries called arterioles. So looking here, you see the elastic, really big. This is close to the heart. As they get further away, more muscular. And then as you get even further away, you get these tiny arteries called arterioles. These are going to lead right into the capillaries. As far as these other details on this slide, you don't really need to know a whole lot, just basically what I'm telling you right now. So then after the arterioles, blood's going to flow through the capillaries. Capillaries are different than arteries and veins because they don't have all those three layers. They just have the inner layer called the tunica intima, which is the endothelium, and this basement membrane right around it. And another thing you can notice in this picture is that capillaries do not just exist by themselves. They're always in a network, and we call this a capillary bed. And you can see how it's like a network of capillaries. And again, this is where gas and nutrient exchange occurs, so you want really, really thin walls there. And so capillary bed, that's the term that I use to describe this network of capillaries. If we look closer at a capillary bed, you see a few things. So here's your arterial side. Here's the arteriole coming in. You see all the smooth muscle. And then blood would flow through the capillary bed and then eventually leave the other side in a vein, which is a small vein called a venule, which we'll talk about next. But notice that the blood is changing color as it's flowing through, just to note that it's changing from oxygenated to deoxygenated on the venous side. And this is the systemic circulation because it is dropping off oxygen to the tissues that need it. One other term I'm going to give you right now is, if you look closely, even within this capillary bed, you get these little rings of smooth muscle. These are called precapillary sphincters, and they can regulate blood flow through the capillary beds also. All right, more on the capillaries. There's three major types. Most of our capillaries that we generally think about are continuous. And that's this. It's basically what I said earlier. Basically the tunica intima, simple squamous cells forming the endothelium, and that's it. So very small microscopic vessels, thin-walled, but your basic capillary. That's called a continuous capillary. We do have some other types, and if you look at this is called a fenestrated capillary, and you can see the difference is it has holes in it. So those holes are called fenestrations, and the fenestrations basically make the capillary more leaky, so we tend to find these where you want filtration to take place. So for example, you have lots of fenestrated capillaries in the kidneys, where the kidneys are actually filtering out the blood. So fenestrated capillaries just have holes in them to help with filtration. And then if you get really big holes, well, they call them large fenestrations here, it's now called a sinusoid, which is the third type of capillary. Sinusoids are similar to fenestrated capillaries in that they're leaky, but as obviously you can tell from this picture that they're more leaky. So you find this where you want massive amounts of blood to be filtered, and so the big place we have this in the human body is the liver, because the liver takes in all the stuff that you take in via digestion, and it tries to figure out what to do with all this stuff. So this is sinusoid. It's a type of capillary found primarily in the liver. So onto the venous side, remember veins carry blood towards the heart. They act as a blood reservoir. What I mean by that is that they store lots of blood because remember the lumen is really big. And then systemic veins have deoxygenated blood because they're returning from dropping off oxygen. Pulmonary veins, on the other hand, have oxygenated blood because they're coming back from the lungs. And then there's two major types, just your standard vein, which I showed you earlier, and then small veins called venules. So if you can envision blood coming back from the capillaries after it's gone through the arteries and arterioles, capillary bed, then it's coming back to the heart. It'll enter these small veins called venules, and then eventually normal, medium to even bigger veins. So the heart would be up here, where the bigger veins actually dump the blood back into the heart. So kind of with the arteries, the closer you are to the heart, the bigger the size. And you can see the veins actually have valves, like we talked about earlier, and the venules do not. So as far as any of these things that you need to know, diapedesis is a process that occurs a lot in venules. Diapedesis is the process by which some white blood cells can get out of the circulation and go into tissues for inflammation and repair, etc. And then other things, just veins work under low pressure, which is why they have the valves to prevent backflow. And then this phenomenon called the skeletal muscle pump impacts veins. So what that is, if you look at this, most of our skeletal muscles have veins running through them. And so by contracting skeletal muscle, we get a pumping effect. So if you can envision yourself walking and just thinking about like your calf muscles and your leg muscles, they're gradually or consistently contracting and relaxing. So you're getting this pumping effect. And that in essence helps kind of pump blood back towards the heart. And we call that the skeletal muscle pump. This is really important, obviously, during exercise, because you get this pumping effect, like if you're running, and that's going to help pump blood back to the heart and keep blood flow going throughout the circulation. So blood pressure is, we've all heard of, but blood pressure is the pressure by the blood exerted on the arterial walls. So unless you specifically say you're talking about venous blood pressure, it's generally implied that you're talking about arterial blood pressure, because as we said earlier, the pressure in the arteries is always going to be higher. So blood pressure is measured in units called millimeters mercury, mmHg. And when we measure blood pressure, you're probably aware that you get two numbers commonly. The higher number is the systolic pressure, the lower number is the diastolic pressure. Systolic is the pressure on the arterial walls when the heart is contracting. So remember, systole meant contraction. So during the contraction phase of the heart, that is the systolic blood pressure. When the heart relaxes, the pressure in your vessels is going to drop a little bit, and then that's your diastolic blood pressure. So every time your heart beats, you actually get a systolic and diastolic blood pressure. But when you go to, let's say, the physician's office and they measure your blood pressure, what you're actually getting is an average of the systolic and diastolic pressures. So just to say it again, systolic is the pressure when the heart is contracting, diastolic is the pressure when the heart is relaxing, and it's constantly fluctuating between the two. The pulse pressure is the pressure of a pulse of blood moving through your circulation. So all it is your systolic blood pressure minus your diastolic blood pressure. So if your systolic blood pressure and diastolic was 120 over 80, meaning systolic is 120, diastolic is 80, your pulse pressure would be 40. And then the mean arterial pressure is just the average pressure between systolic and diastolic. As opposed to what you might think, it's not just a straight average. So if your blood pressure is 120 over 80, systolic over diastolic, your mean arterial pressure is not 100. And the reason being is because the heart spends most of its time, at least at rest, in diastole, meaning it's resting most of the time, so you have to weight the average more towards the diastolic pressure. So there's actually an equation you can use to estimate this, but I'm not going to put it up for you. But just be aware that the mean arterial pressure is an average, but at rest it has to be weighted more towards the diastolic pressure. So just to give you an idea, if your blood pressure was 120 over 80, your mean arterial pressure would be around 93. So it's weighted more towards the diastolic pressure.